This is another lecture created to introduce you to important principles of ethics. Once again, I am Professor Barry Penn-Hollar, and I have prepared these lectures for use in ethics courses at Shenandoah University. Hopefully, they are helping you to strengthen the critical apparatus you will bring to the study of the moral life and to the particular issues we will look at in this course.
As I've said throughout this course, we will be using what's called a case approach. That means we will focus often on scenarios that involve controversial contemporary moral issues, or scenarios in which the individual in that situation is uncertain about what is right or wrong to do, or where many of us in analyzing the situation would be in disagreement about what is right or wrong to do. We will analyze those cases, structuring our analysis using 5 basic moral principles: autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and fidelity. There are 2 underlying convictions, or 2 assumptions, that I'll be asking you to bring to this analysis and this moral reflection, this critical thinking about the moral life. The first one is that these 5 principles apply to all human beings and apply to all human beings equally. The second is that these principles are prima facie rather than absolute. This iMovie lecture is dedicated to explaining that first underlying conviction. The idea that these 5 principles apply to all human beings and to all human beings equally is similar to and related to a claim made by the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He argued that valid moral norms and judgments are universalizable. What he meant is this: any moral judgment we would make, if it is truly valid, is one that we are willing to apply to all people in all times and all places. It's universalizable. It's not something particular to certain people in certain situations. It is truly universally valid. This means then that if someone were to say, well, you may have an obligation not to hurt people, to which the principle of non-maleficence points, but I don't, they would be wrong. Or put differently, if the principle of non-maleficence is truly a valid moral principle, if judgments we make pointing to that principle are in fact valid, they apply to everyone. Everyone is obligated by them. So it is wrong for one person to exclude themselves, claiming somehow that it doesn't apply to them. Think about this contemporary moral issue you may have heard about. Apparently, one of the techniques that is widely used in the interrogation of terror suspects in a place like Guantanamo is waterboarding. And some people consider waterboarding torture, and as such, a cruel and inappropriate form of interrogation, or appropriate technique to use in interrogation. Now, if that judgment is right, that torture is absolutely wrong, that waterboarding is torture, if we would condemn other folk for using that technique, then we ought also condemn ourselves. Or put differently, we ought also to regard it as immoral or wrong when it's us or our country or those we identify with who are using that technique. That's because moral judgments are universalizable, and a valid moral principle like non-maleficence applies to everyone. No one may be excluded from the obligations to which it points. Now, we also want to say that these principles apply equally to all human beings in the sense that all people, all human beings, are protected by these principles, not just obligated by them, but protected. So, if someone were to say, well, I agree that I have an obligation to help my fellow Americans, to be concerned about their welfare, to assist them when they are in situations of need, I have no such obligation toward people from Nigeria. If someone were to say that, they are wrong if, in fact, these principles apply equally to all people. Universalizability means no one may be excluded from our moral consideration, from our protection. This invalidates many of the isms with which you are familiar. Racism, which distinguishes different obligations for people of different races. Sexism, which treats women differently. Consider racism. This is the idea that people of a particular race are excluded from moral concern, or that we have different obligations to them on the basis of their race. Of course, that was the foundation of historic segregation and racial discrimination in our country. The folks who were doing that didn't think they were doing anything wrong because they thought they had very different obligations to black people. Similarly, slavery in the United States was race-based slavery. Only a black person could be enslaved. Now, if this idea is right, that all people are protected and all people protected equally by our moral principles, then such racism is wrong. Similarly, sexism, the idea that different standards apply with respect to our treatment of males and females, is wrong. Today, many people complain that women still receive less pay than men for doing the same work and being similarly successful at that work. If that's true, and if in fact these moral principles apply equally to all human beings, then such discrimination on the basis of gender is wrong. Now, let me suggest here a caveat, or an exception, or a window of exception, with respect to this idea that all are protected equally by these moral principles. This idea does not exclude the possibility that you and I have responsibilities to and for particular people that we don't have to others. I, for example, have obligations to my family that I don't have to you. I have obligations to you as my students that I don't have to people who are not my students. You, as a healthcare professional or in whatever profession you enter, will have obligations to your clients that you don't necessarily have to other people. That is not excluded by the idea that these principles apply to all human beings and to all human beings equally. Pay attention when we discuss the principle of fidelity to a distinction between what are called general and special obligations. Still, despite this caveat, we want to say that our basic and fundamental moral obligations are the same to all people. These moral principles apply to all human beings and to all human beings equally. Now, of course, it's always appropriate in a philosophy class to ask why. Why do we have obligations to human beings? And why do those obligations apply to all human beings? These ideas seem to suggest that there is something about us, something unique to us as human beings, that makes us moral creatures, creatures we ought to respect, creatures who ought to show respect to each other, or are capable of showing respect. Well, what is it? What might be that characteristic we have unique to us as human beings that makes us moral creatures, owing respect and being owed respect by others? There have been a variety of suggested answers to this over the years. One influential and compelling reason that has been offered to explain the reason that human beings are moral creatures capable of giving respect and being owed respect is the idea that this is rooted in our capacity for rationality or reason. Particularly significant here is the idea that our rationality includes self-awareness, self-consciousness, self-transcendence. It's not simply that we can think about things and think well about things, but it is that we can make ourselves the object of our own reflection. We can step back, we can achieve critical distance from all the ways that we are influenced by external stimuli, all the ways that we are shaped by the teaching of our parents or the values of our own culture. We can step back from all that, make it the object of our own reflection, and therefore think, choose, value, and act for ourselves as individuals. Again, for that famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant, this is the reason, he said, that human beings could never be treated merely as means to other people's ends, but are in fact ends in ourselves, owed deep moral respect. Now, H.L.A. Hart, a British moral and legal philosopher, has suggested a very different kind of explanation for why human beings are owed moral respect, or have come to be regarded by other human beings as owed moral respect. He says all that is rooted in our the relative equality of our vulnerability to injury or to harm, and our relative equality of power. And think about this: even the most wealthy, strong, important among us is still vulnerable to injury and harm, still easily injured, still easily killed. And all of us are relatively equal in our power to inflict harm on others. So what that means, if you think about it, is that none of us, no matter how important, no matter how rich, no matter how strong, can make ourselves invulnerable to the capacity of others to inflict injury or harm. And Hart found that very interesting, and he argued that precisely because of that, if human society was going to develop, if human beings were going to survive, if human beings were going to be able to devote themselves to anything other than personal security, then we had to learn to recognize and respect each other as moral creatures, to restrain ourselves in relation to one another, at least to the point of not inflicting injury and harm on each other willy-nilly or without profound and serious moral justification. Now you can see this is closely related to the idea that non-maleficence is a fundamental moral principle. Another reason that has been suggested for this idea that all human beings are owed moral respect is to notice that our fulfillment or our happiness as human beings seems to depend on others. I mean, it's not simply that none of us is completely independent or self-sufficient, that we need other people to grow our food or build our cars or our houses or whatever. It goes more deeply than that, to the recognition that each of us in one way or another depends upon friendship or intimacy with others for our happiness. We all need others. And every human being then is a potential source of friendship or intimacy, a potential source of fulfillment for that deepest of human needs. So some would argue that this social aspect of our nature is the basis for the idea that all human beings are owed respect, recognition, or protection. Now, religious traditions will give a religious answer to this question, pointing to the reality that, or the idea that all human beings are somehow created by a common God. The Jewish and Christian traditions say that we are all in God's image, all are God's children. Now, in saying that, that does not spare religious traditions from philosophical reflection. It does not make that philosophical reflection unnecessary. Because still one might ask, if we all are in God's image, what is it about us that makes us godlike, if you will? And then religious thinkers or theologians will find themselves reflecting on the same human characteristics that philosophers reflect on. Well, maybe it's our rationality, our capacity for self-transcendence that makes us in the image of God. Or maybe it's our social nature. Some Christian theologians have said, pointing to the idea that God is in God's essence a trinity of three persons united in love. Well, it is our interdependence that is the godlike feature in us that makes us moral creatures deserving of moral respect. An interesting contemporary theologian thinking along these lines has suggested that the basis for all religion and for morality is a mystical sense of awe and wonder before the reality of life or the universe and human personhood. So he says that the ultimate root of our sense that all human beings are moral creatures deserving of respect is an almost mystical experience in the presence of the depth of another human being that causes us to be aware, to use Kant's language, that no human being may be treated merely as a means to our own ends, but must be respected. Well, an interesting idea. Well, this concludes our discussion of the first of two underlying convictions that you will need to understand as you use these 5 principles in the way I'm asking you to. The first is the idea that they apply to everyone. All people are protected by them. All are obligated by them, because there's something about us as human beings that makes us moral creatures. Next time, we'll look at the second conviction, that these principles are prima facie rather than absolute.